welcome. I am Bob Geller with PR Dun& Dunner. We have a great topic and a great guest today. He's a real dynamo. He's rocking it in digital marketing as CEO of Outcomes Rocket. And I'm sorry for that pun, but I'm probably not the first to say that. But it's a recognized and respected digital marketing brand. He hosts a podcast of the same name. His consultancy helps healthcare companies scale and thrive. The guest superpowers spring from 20 years of experience in healthcare sales and marketing, and he's previously worked for major players like Stryker, NuVasive, and Medtronic. And on the Outcomes Rocket podcast, he interviews the most inspiring leaders in healthcare. That's a popular and highly ranked podcast, I might add. And podcasting is what we are here to discuss today. So without any further delay, let me please introduce Saul Marquez. Welcome to the pod, Saul.
Bob, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here with you and your listeners.
Likewise, it's great to meet you, and look forward to having a great conversation and learning from you. How does it feel to be on the other side of the podcast? By the way, I assume you've done this before, or
Yeah, no, it's always nice to be on the other side. I'm very used to being the host, so it's refreshing. I like being your guest here, Bob.
Excellent. Well, from one podcaster and a marketer to another one, like I said, it is great to meet you, and I've been checking out your podcast. I love it. And I can relate to it. I come from a family of doctors, and at Fusion PR, we've done our share of work in the healthcare sector. Just a quick question. Is the name kind of a double entendre? It seems to be.
It is. I was searching for a good kind of hooky name, and Outcomes Rocket is about outcomes, the double entendre being healthcare outcomes, business outcomes. And then the rocket comes from, it was inspired from the idea of, Google's idea of moonshots. So this idea that don't go for 10%, go for 10x, think big, because that's what inspires. And so that's where the rocket comes from.
Makes a lot of sense. How long have you been in business?
So we've been in business for just about 10 years, and the podcast, been podcasting for about 7.
Wow, you got in early. That's great.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's as I tell my wife, it's the best club I ever joined. I get to hang out who I want to hang out with and learn from mentors. And as you probably feel, Bob, right? It's like the best club you could join, starting a podcast.
Meet great people, learn things. That's what it's about, right? So we've seen this. I mean, like, I've been in the business longer than you. My gray hairs show it. But through the years, decades, we've seen CEOs, brands, executives jump on other communications vehicles, whether it was CEO blogs way back in the day. Some of them, I'm sure, still blog, social media. Now it seems like podcasts are the rage. Am I just thinking that, or would you agree? I mean, is it a pretty big phenomenon? Generally, we know that it is. I mean, I guess with CEOs, is that something you're seeing more and more of?
Definitely. And, Bob, the numbers, facts, figures kind of speak for it too. There was a recent survey conducted by Content Effects. They took about 511 individuals. And in this group, it was actually very tailored. It was owners, executives, it was members of leadership teams. And the geographic location was US and UK.
Okay.
And so in those findings, they really found out some really interesting things that reflect sort of the topic of our conversation today is, should a CEO have a podcast? And so business decision makers, including owners and executives, they're frequent podcast listeners, with 55% of business owners and founders listening to podcasts daily.
Big number,
right? And then the second, so I've got 4 insights here that I'll share, and then we could unpack them.
Oh, let's hear.
Okay. The second point of the survey was branded podcasts boost top of funnel metrics, which in the end increased brand awareness and favorability of listeners by 20%. So all of that awareness that you're trying to drive, huge opportunity with a branded podcast, and especially if the voice of the company, the CEO, is running it. The third insight out of the four is podcast likability significantly influences brand awareness
Hmm.
and favorability. So check this out, Bob. A preferred podcast generates 3.1 times more brand awareness and
Wow.
2.1 times more brand favorability. And then here's the last thing that I'll share with you. And then we could unpack it and have some fun with
Yeah.
a good discussion around it. Branding matters. So clips with more brand mentions tended to perform better on brand opinions, actions, and recommendations. So if you do it, if you're thinking about doing it, you're probably thinking, how should I do this? By all means, include your brand. You could whisper it and just kind of put it on the little corner, or you could be loud and make it the title. But by all means, include your brand in it. So couple stats there that validate this is happening and it's impactful.
What if it's not a well-known brand though? Does that matter?
No, actually, and that's the reason why you should do it, right?
Mm.
If it's not a well-known brand, you need to work with PR companies like Bob's,
Mm.
and do some owned media efforts such as a podcast to
Sure.
put the word out.
That makes a lot of sense. No, I mean, well, what about getting back to unpacking these numbers? Just a couple of questions. What was this data across industries, B2B and B2C? Was it for certain types of companies, certain size companies?
Great question. Yeah, it was actually B2B and B2C decision makers. And so it was both B2B and B2C across different industries. But the key thing to that out of their survey was that they were owners, executives, and members of leadership teams and managers. So decision makers, right? So if you're a CEO, you want to influence decision makers,
Yep,
and
absolutely.
this survey speaks to them.
Well, the opportunities are clear. I think you painted a very nice picture. I guess in some ways, though, the opportunities present the challenges because everybody wants in. People are podcasting. It's not just podcasting. There's competition from lots of other kinds of news and content information that's out there. So I guess, let's assume somebody's curious, a company, a CEO, and they want to possibly jump in. They obviously have to understand it better and they have to figure out how to make it interesting, compelling, make it work for them in some of the ways you've described. So that leads to a lot of questions. Um, for example, what is involved in it? Does it have to take a lot of time, a lot of money? What is involved?
Yeah. No, I love
At a
it.
high
Great.
level, because I know it could be probably hundreds of steps, but I mean,
Yeah, there's like if you like there's so many steps, but it could be very simple, right? And so we'll capture the main buckets. Number one, don't be afraid. Like there's a lot of steps, but it actually is quite simple. As a leader of a company, you have a team, and that's why they're there to support you in your efforts. And the main buckets that you guys should be thinking about right now is really four buckets, and we'll cover. Bob, you asked that ahead of the show that you wanted to dig into the cost and the mechanics. So really four buckets. Number one is booking, getting the people on your show. It's the outreach, it's the booking of the guests on your show. The second bucket is content. So when you produce, you have content to produce. You have audio, video, and you have copy. Those are the three things that you have to worry about under content. Then
okay.
the third bucket is publishing, getting it onto the host, then getting it onto your website. And the fourth bucket is promoting, right? Promoting it on social media and getting the word out there. So those are the four buckets. Bob, how do you want me to unpack them? I could
Well,
talk costs, I could talk time. Like it's up to you what you want me to do here.
I have a couple more questions, and if there's any points you think are worth expanding on. But first of all, the
Yeah.
first point, I mean, we've all seen the phenomena of the YouTuber. I guess it gets kind of overlaps, YouTubing, podcasting. It's one person, an individual. You said booking. Is it important to have guests? Do you have to have guests? Or
Great question. Now, and this sort of like there's a question behind the question there too, Bob. So is it important to have guests? And my answer is if you have a B2B business and you're creating a podcast, it is fundamental that you have guests. because one of the things when we bring on folks, we have a production agency or a digital marketing agency, and we create podcasts for a lot of leaders, a lot of companies.
You're right.
The podcast is a funnel, and it's a marketing funnel, and this podcast funnel actually has two sides. On the one hand, it's the listeners. On the other hand, it's your guests. You could do a solo podcast and educate, right? Well, we could touch on that and unpack that. But right now, if you have a B2B company, you should be having guests on your show,
Right.
because the short-term ROI of a podcast exists with the guests that you invite. If you're very intentional about the content you create, we at Outcomes Rocket, we call it just content co-creation with your ideal buyer. And when you're co-creating content and you're reaching out to people that you want to do business with, you're not reaching out to them and saying, hey, check out my widget. Here are my wares. You're saying, hey, I really love what you're doing, and I have this thing that I talk to healthcare leaders, us in particular, healthcare leaders, but leaders. Then you invite them to co-create. That is so key, and while listeners matter, everybody listening, you matter. You matter. In a B2B podcast strategy, a podcast is a not a cost center. It's actually ROI. Like, there's a return on podcast investment. And you do it by carefully crafting the show concept and carefully attracting the right type of guest to be spending time with you. And then, the magic happens before and after you hit record. You when you say hi and when you conclude, and then when you update them on when their podcast is going to go live. All of these are great touch points where you could have conversations in ways that you could add value. So that's sort of like the guest question is, you need to have it if you have a B2B business.
That makes sense. I mean, it's getting to some of the things you mentioned: collaboration, content co-creation, supporting each other's credibility. I'd imagine you need to consider audience at some point, assuming you want to reach the right people. So
yeah, for sure, Bob. And like I always say that to be controversial, right? Because you get a reaction, but you make the point that you need to focus on your guests. Your listeners are significantly important.
we love our listeners, right? We love them. Don't go away.
Don't go away, stay with us. But if you're a business owner, the one thing that you should be thinking about is, if I start a podcast, here's what we tell our clients. It's downloads are vanity, contacts and relationships are sanity. And that's what your vehicle should be focused on.
I love that. That's very catchy. So, I mean, let's, I guess, differentiate this concept with a commercial podcast. We're not necessarily, maybe the metrics are different. We're not necessarily after, maybe we are building a tremendous audience. I don't know. You tell me. I mean, what are the numbers to measure against? What should the goals be? I mean, how do you said ROI. I mean, glad you mentioned that, but it's a bold promise, I think. I mean, hopefully it's something that can be done.
Yeah, for sure. So like, if you're a business, right? And I'm always going to go back to that, right? If you are a business creating a podcast, it is part of your it is part of your owned outbound marketing strategy.
Right.
So you're creating this, your ROI is going to come from the opportunities you create to grow your business by selling your services and the products that you sell.
I see. And
right.
Okay. You're saying?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
Well, you should be able to measure that over some time frame, I would think, before podcast, after podcast, 1 year down the road, maybe. I don't know what's realistic, but.
Definitely. And by the way, like, what should I expect is probably a question that's come in the listeners' minds. It's a long-term investment. So it's really you should expect to see a return, depending on what your average contract value is, 6 to 9 months. Like, you'll be crushing it with podcasting if you're doing it right. Like, you'll be developing thought leadership content for awareness, and you'll be creating a nice funnel with amazing leaders that have gotten to know and respect you for what you do, but now are curious about what you and your company does. A lot of our clients today have have been guests on our podcast. At the Outcomes Rocket, we've interviewed a lot of healthcare leaders where our focus is healthcare. And we add value, and they come to know us, respect us, get curious about what we do, and then there's a need, in some cases, and they become our clients. So it works, and it works very well.
That's a beautiful thing. I
It
have
is.
several related questions, so bear with me. But
Sure.
I guess, what does this take in terms of a CEO's time, which I guess relates to what is the ideal frequency? And the final part of this these series of questions is, do most companies, their own marketing teams, can they handle this? Or I'm assuming it would be good to hire an outcomes rocket. But I mean, do you find most client side teams are savvy enough to do it on their own?
Most where the area, we talked about the 4 buckets, right? Booking, content, publishing, promoting.
Right.
And where most people get hung up is the content production. It's the audio and the video production, like
I see.
sitting there with sound waves and clipping this and that is honestly where a lot of people get frustrated and quit or don't even start.
The AV geek side kind of things.
Yeah, exactly.
You said content. I said that's the fun part, coming up with the ideas. But you're talking about the engineering part of it.
The production
Production.
side
Okay.
of the content. Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. The ideas are fun, but making it all beautiful and sounding great in a way that matches your brand quality. That's where I feel like very few, unless you're a content heavy organization that you're already doing videos and audio as part of your, whether it's your product because you're an educational company, or it's part of what you do and you just value it and you have internal staff that does it as part of your social strategy, right? If you don't have that, then you would want to outsource that for sure, because you don't want to deal with it, and it's honestly, it could make or break how your brand is perceived. So you want it to be super high quality.
Well, I should be taking notes here. I'm thinking, I mean, is there something to be said for the DIY ethos, or you really think that could harm a brand? I mean, do you really need a full production team and all the bells and
Look,
whistles?
there's 2 ways you could do it, right? You could do it a DIY, get on Fiverr, get on Upwork, find somebody that's gonna do the production for you and piece it together. And by the way, some companies may need to do that, and that's okay. But if you want quality to be part of the equation and not have to worry about it, and you want to spend less time, then you want to hire an agency to take care of it for you. Like
Makes sense.
like, so you asked about time, right, Bob? Like, the time for a CEO, that's where I have a lot of fun. And anybody that decides to do podcasting with us, I tell them, you just show up. Like we do the booking for you. We create like the content. All you have to do is show up. We've systematized the headshot, the bio, making sure you basically have 5 minutes of prep time. You get to see who your guests are, and then you show up for your interview. You have a great conversation, connect afterwards a little bit, and move on. Most of our clients are doing 2 podcasts a month. That's sort of like
That's not so bad.
no, it's not bad. How many do you do, Bob?
I try to do about once a month. I mean, we have a team.
Okay,
I have a co-host who sometimes takes turns. Once a month, we
nice.
probably should increase the frequency. No question about that.
Hey, but listen, kudos, you're doing it. And that's the beauty of it. Like, I give you a lot of credit for having the courage and the creativity to make it happen. There's a lot of people listening to this right now that have thought about it and they've gotten stuck. So let's get inspiration from Bob, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you. I'm having fun with it. But I guess that leads to another question, and not that,
Yeah.
that I have such a magical personality or I'm just great for this, but I mean, do you sometimes meet clients or CEOs that aren't ideally suited? Is there a personality type that is best suited for podcasting? Or
Oh,
can you
for sure.
train them? Can you train them to be
You-
better?
See, here's the thing. Bob, you gotta have fun. Like this has to be something you enjoy.
Mm.
It can't be something you like dread. And I've had conversations, and there's different ways to get after a goal or a KPI. Podcasting is just one of them, right? But to answer your question, I've had conversations with founders and CEOs where I've said, this is not for you because you're not going to enjoy this. Like you don't like doing this. You don't want to talk to people. Like, and that's okay. Like if you don't want to do this, you shouldn't. Um, but if you are someone that, enjoys networking and connecting with others and exploring ideas, it could definitely be a fun thing, especially if you don't have to deal with any of the monotony that goes with the production, the creation, and the publishing of it. So yeah, it's a good fit for some and it's not a good fit for others.
Well, I'd imagine most CEOs aren't the shy retiring type, and maybe they are good for it. On the other hand, if they're not or they don't want to do it, maybe there's somebody on their C-suite team who would do it instead, who might be very good at it and might want to do it. If it's a
Yeah,
chore, you're not gonna, like you said, I mean, you have to enjoy it or the idea of it.
totally.
Uh, and you have to have something
And
to share, I think, and,
yeah, and Bob, if I may, I'll offer a tip that we often share with
please,
people starting podcasts.
please.
Yeah, bandwidth is real. Like we're busy. You got meetings with the board, you got meetings with investors, you got clients. And so one of the cool things you could do is to share the burden of hosting. So you could start a podcast and have a co-host. It could be your chief revenue officer, your VP of marketing. And the nice thing about that is that it helps spread thought leadership across the organization, but it also helps you get off the hook if you really have to.
Good point.
Um, and by the way, you could decide you love it and it says you have a co-host and they never show up, and that's okay. But you have a co-host and you could sprinkle them in.
Yes, we see my co-host here once in a while. I'm here more often.
You
But
applied
anyway,
the strategy, Bob.
it's not intentional. It just kind of wound up that way. But I guess part of this gets to the goals. If it's company branding, then you have a face for the company and you have the branding, and that supports it. If you're really after executive profiling in one individual, then I guess you'd focus on that individual. What about have you ever dabbled in roundtables, panels? Is that something worth
Yeah,
looking
it's really interesting. And that comes up often because we'll get a group of people and they'll say, hey, I want to invite two guests or three guests. I would recommend, and here's what happens when you have a limited amount of time, and you could decide how long you want your show to go. Bob, yours is about like 45 minutes to an hour, right? I was listening to a couple podcasts before I
Yes,
got on.
roughly, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Especially if it's a
Um,
pan if it's a panel, typically goes for the full hour. If it's a one-on-one, it may go for 40 minutes.
yeah. I love that's a great length. Like a 40-minute show is a really nice length. And what ends up happening is, my podcast, mine's on average 22 minutes per
Right,
podcast.
right.
We noticed, and every show is different. So we took a look at our Apple Analytics and noticed when we were about 500 episodes in that people were dropping off at that 20-ish minute mark. And back then our show was 30, on average 32, 35 minutes. So we took that data and we said, people want shorter, for us. But then you listen to somebody like Joe Rogan, he's got an hour, 2 hour podcast, different,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
Um,
Good point. Good point.
yeah.
Uh,
So
mhm.
you got to look at the data, make some decisions on what you want to do.
How do you look at the data? What
Oh
kind of
yeah. Great question. So the most reliable data and by the way, there's different platforms, right? The most reliable data thus far on listener engagement is Apple's backend, Apple
okay.
Podcast backend. So Podcast Connect at Apple, and they have the most reliable data right now that I've been able to pick up on engagement. You're able to see number of listeners when they pick up, when they drop off. This could really give you a lot of insights when you're several episodes in on ways that you could tailor your show to really the length that is resonating with people. Maybe topics, right? You could do some research on titles and topics that have resonated more or less with people. But yeah, right now our experience has been, Apple has the most robust. Spotify is second in their ability to provide data. Now it also depends where you're hosting it, right? You could be on Megaphone, which has more robust data than Spotify for podcasters. Both Spotify products, that provide data. And then I would put iHeartRadio analytics in third, in ability to kind of discern things that would help you make like iterations to get your podcast to the next level.
All right. Well, listen, I hope we're not losing people because we're going to get into how the sausage debate here.
That's true.
And
That's true.
maybe it's a little bit of a podcast, maybe it's a little bit of therapy for me. But I mean, okay. So do you host? Does it matter really where you host to use a distribution mechanism like we use Anchor FM? And
Oh, cool. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so what should I rely on analytics from there, or do you optimize for each platform that it goes to and have a home on Spotify, a home on Apple?
Yeah. So like you'll naturally get all of your analytics from the host, so Anchor, right?
Okay.
And but if you want more in-depth data, like Apple always keeps their own analytics. So when you go to Apple, if you set up your, I don't want to get too much in the detail, but I'll share
Yeah.
it with you, Bob, and then we'll move on.
Yeah.
But it's either you let Anchor do the distribution for you, and they own the Apple account for you. You can't see your analytics that way. If you didn't do the auto distribution and you actually went to Apple and set up the account through Apple, then you could get it. You could always get it back. You just have to email support and they'll get you access to your Apple account. Then you could go into your Apple account and get all the data. So that's how you would get in the back end and see what I was sharing with you.
That's a great tip. Thank you. We'll come up out of the weeds now and let's talk about, you sent me a list of tips and I'm trying to think if there's any we haven't covered. But I guess now is a good time for you to go into any more details about anything we might have left out. I know you talked about breaking the fourth wall, a seed that keeps on producing content. We already talked about downloads or vanity. What is there anything else you wanted to share?
The breaking the fourth wall, that's a good one, right? And so if you're doing a podcast and you're engaged with your guest, like Bob and I are here, the fourth wall is basically acknowledging that everybody listening is here. So, hey, everybody, I'm glad you're here and you're listening to Bob and I, and I'm glad that Bob and I are doing this because it's a big opportunity for everybody listening to consider podcasting as a form of marketing to help expand your brand reach and opportunities. So I hope you take a look at what Bob puts out in his show notes. So I just broke the fourth wall and I was talking to everybody. And now I'm back with Bob.
That's great. That's great.
It makes a connection, and making that connection is what creates engagement. And people, I was at a marketing conference at the end of last year in Phoenix, and this guy had a slide, and the slide said attention, and he had different things on there. He had social posts, emails, podcasts, and something else. Social posts, 1 or 2 seconds. Emails, 1 or 2 seconds. Podcasts, 14 minutes on average.
Wow.
So if you're engaging, and this is why the report that I shared at the beginning, it's impactful. 43% of B2B and B2C decision makers from the US obtain their business related or thought leadership content from business podcasts. 43%. So they engage. And if they're listening to you for an average 14 minutes, when you go to engage with them and they've already touched your content, there's a big opportunity. Ed Gaudet, Risk Never Sleeps, founder of CEO of Sensinet, customer of ours, third-party risk management. He's shared stories with me that, man, like this makes a difference. Somebody was at an event and they were waiting to meet him. And he was
Wow.
flattered by it,
Wow.
but they were listening to his content. Dr. Kedar Mate and Dr. Don Berwick, they're IHI, Institute for Healthcare Improvement. They have a podcast called Turn on the Lights. They're doing such a phenomenal job of connecting with their audience. And they've realized, because they've gotten feedback, and it's this engagement, that people have with you. And last story I'll give you, Tom Clues, he's the venture lead at Natera Ventures. Really cool, actually. They're NGK, a spark plug producing company. They realized, holy smokes, our business is going to probably be extinct with the electric car in 20 years. So they're investing heavily in healthcare. They're investing in healthcare companies. So Tom was looking for a way to get out there and just make connections with these amazing companies. And through his podcast, he's been able to really get some great deal flow. Those 14 minutes are special. And listeners, you're listening to Bob and me by way of Bob. Thank you for your time and your willingness to spend time with us, because it matters a lot.
Awesome. One more question, and this will also get to other services at Outcomes Rocket, but I'm assuming it's not podcasting full stop. There are other associated marketing services, and that gets to the question, what do you have to do to promote and make your podcast successful? I'm assuming you're promoting not just the podcast, but other activities and other things that the client's doing, but maybe you can explain.
Yeah, Bob, thank you. So appreciate the opportunity to share. So yeah, at Outcomes Rocket, we focus on serving healthcare clients that sell to payers and providers in really three main buckets. It's owned media, it's content, it's creation, audio, video, paid media, it's paid campaigns, ad placements to help you get in front of your ideal clients and accelerate what you could do in a shorter amount of time. And then earned media, right? Helping folks on a lot of the stuff that you do, Bob, with paid placements and things like that. So that's what we do in a nutshell. On the promotion of your podcast, one of the best ways to do it is to be on other podcasts. So
I got to get on more podcasts. Anyway,
Bob, get on more podcasts. You got to get somebody on your team to start pitching you to the other shows. And man, that's a great way. Early on, I made it on a bunch of podcasts. We were able to grow pretty significantly. So best way to get listens is to be on other podcasts. The other thing you want to do is make, when you do your podcasts, be really intentional about the content that you're putting out there. And then it makes it interesting, but then when you post it on social, so another avenue is social promotion. And I have a couple tips here that I'll share. And by the way, the study that I shared with you also highlighted that 36% of the participants highlighted learning new things was the most common reason for listening to podcasts. So if you think about your target audience, make sure you're creating content that helps them learn new things. And then when you do that, when you promote it on social, you highlight the new things and it'll encourage them to click through. The other nice thing is once you get a good amount of podcasts under your belt, you could start doing lists. So you could do a LinkedIn post or an Instagram post that says, we want to highlight our top 10 podcasts. And then you copy all their companies and you copy all the people that you had on. So you create a network effect post. And whenever I do that, and wherever we do that very methodically for marketing, we always see a little bump in our listenership. So that's definitely, think about lists. People love lists. And once you've had several clients, and here's the cool thing, you could also do a list of your ideal guests. So maybe you haven't had them on. You do a list of here are the top 3 people we've had, and here are the lists of the top 5 we would like to have. You're seeing this post, we'll be reaching out to you, but listen to a couple episodes before then. So you naturally get some click through on those and get some nice listenership.
maybe in a similar vein, well, we've done like wraps on the best of the year and included clips from some of our top podcasts. I don't know if you've done something like that, or does that fall
Love
into
that.
your, yeah,
Yeah,
that's,
no, I love that. That's a great idea, Bob. I love
thank,
that.
thank you.
Yeah, that's a really
Well, this has been very helpful. By the way, what was the source? I'm not sure if you mentioned the source for that study, but it sounds like a really interesting study. Do you remember who?
Oh yeah, so I'll give you the link to it. It was a survey conducted by Content FX and Lower Street. They both did it. Content FX is a company that enables surveys and things like that. Lower Street is a podcast production agency. They do some pretty cool work. So I got this info from their insights, and I'll be sharing the link with you, Bob, if you wanted to link it up for the listeners.
That'd be perfect. And I will also include your information in the show notes if that's okay, so people know how to reach you.
Please.
Audience, you should check out Outcomes, Rocket Outcomes, especially if you are in healthcare, and get in touch with Saul. I'll leave information about that. And I guess we'll wrap now. Is there anything else you wanted to share, Saul, or?
No, just wanted to say thank you, Bob. Great to connect with a fellow creator, an entrepreneur. Outcomesrocket.com is where people can find us, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you.
My pleasure. I'll just wrap. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. If you're listening, feel free to rate us and give a review. And with that, I will thank you, Saul, for sharing your expertise and your time with us. It's been extremely helpful, very informative, and I hope we can stay in touch.